Hi there, still doing my packing for the journey. Hopefully remembering to have enough clothes to wear. Always important and always a challenge when you're in Scotland. You never know exactly what to put in. How many t-shirts, thick jumpers, waterproofs and shorts. Probably all for the same day. Probably all within a few hours actually. That's the weather in Scotland though, isn't it? Packing for the journey's never easy. Imagine packing for a journey that lasted for a lifetime, but of course that's the journey that we're on as Christians. We're on this discipleship pathway, following the Lord for the rest of our lives. And it's amazing how, as we were thinking about yesterday, God leads us. He watches over us. He even prepares the way for us, the Bible says. Abraham's servant, he found a wife for Abraham's son Isaac. And at the end, when he was bringing Rebekah back to Isaac, he said, God has granted me success to my journey. Quite interesting the words he says. God has granted me success to my journey. You know, journeys can actually go somewhere. Journeys probably should go somewhere. There's normally a destination for our journey. If you're heading off to the Costa Brava or the Costa del Sol or the Costa Fortune, wherever it is you're going, hopefully, whenever that is able, because of COVID, for us to do that, you're actually heading somewhere and you really want to get to your destination. You don't want to end up somewhere else. As Christians, as we follow the Lord in our lives, we're not just going round in circles like the children of Israel did in the desert. We're actually headed somewhere. Ultimately, we're headed for heaven. We're headed for glory. That's our final destination. I think it's also fair to say that in our lives, what we are aiming to do is to become more and more like Jesus. That our character would change, that our attitudes and motives would change, that we would find ourselves being more holy in the way that we live our lives. I suppose that's one of our destinations. We also want to have the destination of making the most of our life. And God can lead us when we think about job prospects and direction for our life and guidance in that way too. One of the amazing things is that when we journey, we have our destination that God leads us to. And He leads us very specifically into these areas in which He wants us to live. It says in Hebrews 11 that when we journey, we're actually surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, actually people who have travelled before us. And that's the other thing when we journey. We're not journeying on a pathway that has never been travelled on before. There's been many Christians, hundreds and thousands, millions, who have travelled the discipleship pathway before. And they are people who can give us advice if they're still alive, and we can speak to them. But if they have died, then perhaps they have writings, perhaps they are books that we can read. There are sermons we can listen to. We can read the Bible, we can read all about God's people who have travelled before and who can give us advice for the journey. So as you travel on your discipleship pathway, remember first of all that God leads us, and secondly, that God has a destination for us on our journey. Speak to you again tomorrow.